Almost everyone nowadays has a fond memory of spending their mornings eating cereal and watching some version of Scooby Doo. Whether it be the original series or the hit What's New Scooby Doo, there was a version of the Mystery Inc. for everyone to enjoy. But after thinking hard about Scoob and the gang, it's hard not to notice all of the dark and sinister undertones that you can find between the laughter and the mysteries. In fact, these darker tones have led to a theory that seems too good not to be true, but so haunting that you kinda hope it's fake. Because if it's not, that means the quirky characters that fans love so much were actually dead the entire time. Believe it or not, there are actually two theories that consider the possibility of Mystery Inc. being a deceased team of sleuths. Sleuths is such an interesting word to say. It's kind of like sloths, but not really. The side tangents are free, folks. Now, even though both of the theories suggest that Scooby and his friends were deceased, they each have their subtle difference, with the first suggesting that they all died in a car accident and ended up paying for their collective sins together. This theory initially started out as a post on Reddit that simply suggested that Scoob and his friends were all dead the entire time, but simply didn't want to admit it or move on. In turn, they decided to travel around from place to place and debunk fake mysteries about ghosts as a way to convince themselves that ghosts weren't real, therefore they had to still be alive. And boy, is that a psychological puzzle that will mess with your head. But the theory actually expanded a lot over time, with many fans putting their own spin on it, though they're centered around the same theme for the most part. According to the theory, Shaggy, Scooby, Daphne, Velma, and Fred were all part of a crime-solving group with the same name that they had in the show, Mystery Inc. However, on their way to a mystery that took place before any version of the show, they got into a tragic car accident that killed them all on the spot. But instead of passing on to either heaven or hell, Mystery Inc. was trapped in purgatory, kind of like the DCEU. But anyways, it's there that the Mystery Machine became their tomb, which would explain why they never wandered too far from their van or even consider upgrading to a more fuel-efficient vehicle. It's because they can't, at least according to this version of the theory. I also imagine that monster hunting doesn't really pay that well. Nevertheless, in their tomb, Mystery Inc. was left to wander around solving mysteries as a way to atone for the sins that each of the characters was holding on to. And yes, you heard that right. While in purgatory, Fred, Shaggy, and the rest of the crew would have been forced to atone for any past misdeed that they had committed. Now, full disclosure, this is where the theory takes a lot of liberties by getting into some personal information that was never actually confirmed by the creators, but just assumed based on the character design of the young sleuths. For instance, the theory claims that in life, Fred was a womanizer and a sociopathic bully based on how he acted around women in the series. He would always try to become the macho man of the group in order to impress any woman that he came across, and always asserted himself as the leader throughout the show. This could imply that in his real life that was how he saw himself, and in turn was forced to solve mysteries to atone for what he had done. The theory also claimed that Shaggy was a junkie who put drug use above everything, and therefore had to atone for his gluttony by living in a state of constant hunger. He could never fill himself up in purgatory because he could never seem to do so while alive. Now, the big toss-up in the theory actually comes down to the titular character, Scooby Doo. You see, some fans who have adapted this theory suggest that Scoob was never a dog in the first place, and he was actually a demon who watched over them during their indefinite stay in purgatory. And others suggest that he was simply another member of Mystery Inc. that met their tragic fate on that fateful day of the deadly car crash. The second version of the theory is very similar to the car crash theory, only in this case it wasn't every member of the Scooby Gang that lost their lives that day. Interestingly, this theory comes from the same Reddit post that the original theory came from, with one of the fans in the comments suggesting a very interesting crossover. They've suggested that all of the adventures that took place in Scooby Doo were actually set in the same universe as the Ghostbusters the whole time, specifically after the events of Ghostbusters 2, which would explain why the gang being mystery solvers who specifically dabble in the supernatural is a seemingly viable career path. It's because by that point in the Ghostbusters universe, they had already established that ghosts were real and they were a threat that was well known by the public. The theory suggests that in the universe, a bunch of petty criminals began to take advantage of people by creating fake ghosts to haunt their property and scam or even hurt those around them. This is where Mystery Inc. comes in. Sort of, I guess. According to this version of the theory, only two members of Mystery Inc. were actually alive during the series, and that's Shaggy and a pup named Scooby Doo. Side note, how good was A Pup Named Scooby Doo? That show slapped anytime I had to stay home from school in the late 90s and early 2000s. But yeah, according to this theory, Daphne, Velma, and Fred were all actually dead and had become ghosts who hung around Shaggy and Scooby to help them solve mysteries. According to the theory, the three passed away in the 1960s, explaining their clothing choices and respective mannerisms, and their entire reason for choosing Shaggy and Scooby to be their business partners in the mystery-solving industry was actually well calculated, because this theory, like many before it, suggests that Shaggy and Scooby spent most of their time high as kites. And because of that, they couldn't tell the difference between the dead and the living. In other words, Scoob and Shaggy had no idea that they were spending their time with three ghosts who became their closest friends. Now, as for why Fred and the other two ghosts would even consider solving mysteries and busting ghosts, there are really two schools of thought. The first is that they're simply doing it to get rid of the humans who are making a mockery of their kind by pretending to be ghosts, which is the more believable reason. The other reason claims that Velma, Fred, and Daphne were lonely as ghosts and spent time solving mysteries with the hope that they would find a real ghost that they could befriend. Now, it should be pointed out that there is a timeline issue with this theory, seeing as Ghostbusters didn't release until 1984, a whole 5 years after Scooby Doo aired. And that was the first Ghostbusters, so for Scooby Doo to be set after the second Ghostbusters would be a bit confusing. But hey, anything is possible in the world of animation. Out of the two main theories, the most plausible is most likely the horrifying purgatory theory, and that's because it lines up with a lot of what was shown in Scooby Doo. In fact, there's actually a Scooby Doo crossover special that all but confirmed the idea that Scoob and the gang were living in purgatory. About 5 years ago, back in 2018, oh my god, 2018 was 5 years ago. Good grief. Anyways, so back in 2018, Scooby Natural was released. It was a highly anticipated crossover between Scooby Doo and the hit CW series Supernatural. During the crossover, Sam and Dean, the main protagonists of Supernatural, were teleported into an animated world where they solved a mystery with Scoob and the gang. It was a really funny and well thought out crossover, but more important than that, it could be used as confirmation that Scooby Doo was actually set in purgatory. You see, throughout Supernatural, Sam and Dean are often seen dealing with the likes of monsters, and eventually angels and demons, which sees a lot of the show centered around realms like heaven, hell, and yup, you guessed it, purgatory. And according to this theory, when Sam and Dean were transported into Scooby's world, they were actually transported to purgatory, and much like Mystery Inc., who was forced to solve mysteries and atone for their sins, the two supernatural characters had to join them. Now, the purgatory theory would also explain a lot of the strange and impossible things that occurred around Shaggy, Scooby, and the rest of the gang. Just think about it. Since purgatory isn't supposed to be the exact same as Earth, the laws of physics and the concept of what's real and what isn't are probably super different. But don't quote me on that. I've never been. And that explains why Scooby was able to talk in the first place and why no one questioned it. But that wasn't the only oddity to occur in Scooby Doo though. As mentioned before, Scooby and his owner Shaggy seemed to have bottomless pits for stomachs, and whenever they needed to, they could unhinge their jaws like snakes and eat sandwiches that were well over a foot tall. The purgatory theory could also explain why the gang seemed to run into real supernatural beings as well. While most of the ghosts that the group interacted with were fake, there were a few occasions when they dealt with something that was horrifyingly real. When Scooby and Shaggy ended up at the Ghoul School in the special Scooby Doo and the Ghoul School, they interacted with vampires, mummies, and other monsters who were 100% real. Things like that wouldn't be possible in the real world since clearly ghosts wouldn't exist. However, in purgatory, with the rules being vastly different, ghosts and ghouls could certainly exist. Granted, the show definitely makes it seem like most supernatural happenings were caused by normal people, but that doesn't mean Mystery Inc. never came across a real monster. The big question now is, how do you feel about the Mystery Gang being dead throughout your entire childhood? Did they actually die in that van, or is that a little too dark for a show that takes place in a world with monsters and ghouls? Well, make sure to let me know in the comments below, and I look forward to reading all of them.